Again, thank you for being here. I'm excited about the conversations that are happening this weekend. And I hope that you'll pay attention to what you hear in the seminars and the workshops as we gather tomorrow. I especially want you to pay attention to where you hear the Holy Spirit. Look for those kairos moments, those moments in where you feel poked and provoked. Maybe you feel your anxiety even being raised, or even where you're quick to judge something. Usually those things are not our discernment as much as we'd like to justify them. They are usually God trying to get a hold of us for some reason. So pay attention to those moments. I believe every one of us here, even though the majority of us are later years in life than the people that spoke just now, I believe each one of us are here and are called for the reason of church planting or multiplying the church. In fact, I would make the statement that I believe every follower of Jesus is called to do that. But sadly, far too often, we don't live into what we've been designed to do. It's why we've been talking about church planting for a decade, and we still have very few things. It's why this morning it is the same faces that we are used to, and we haven't grafted much more in. It's because we know what we've been designed to do, but far too often we actually don't live into it. However, I'm praying this weekend that God will be lighting a flame in some of you through the seminars, through the workshops, through worship, and through the conversations that we're going to have over coffee. I want you to see that God is doing something this weekend. And I'm pretty sure that Omar and Britton and others want to see what God is doing in you this weekend. And so I'm going to encourage you to use a hashtag. Well, I thought we might attract some younger people with this conversation. So I'm not sure how many of you will know how to hashtag, but I'm going to encourage you to try it. Because if church planting is going to make you uncomfortable, let's get started by talking about hashtags and using those. And I want to know what God is doing. So as you begin to feel things in you, as you begin to take pictures, or you hear reflections or quotes stand out to you, I encourage you to share it to your social media. And as you share it, use that hashtag, I will multiply 2017. And the reason I want you to use that hashtag is two reasons. One, because it's a statement. I will multiply. And the second reason is because when I click that hashtag later, I can see all the things that stood out to you. And as we talk about what went well here and what didn't, we can see what did. I'll ignore what didn't. So my name is Jeff McLain, as Omar said. I'm the lead pastor here at East Petersburg Mennonite Church. I was just made the lead pastor just a few weeks ago, and so I am super excited that one of my kickoff events is that we get to host this Spring Leadership Assembly. I love that we are hosting a conversation on missional movement and multiplication. And if you're still around on Sunday, let me just put in a plug that I would encourage you to come out. It is a holiday weekend, so take a break from wherever you are and join us for worship. We are a small community that is learning to live and love like Jesus here in East Petersburg. Allow me to introduce myself and my story for just a few minutes. In addition to serving pastor here, I also partner or volunteer as a coach with Church on the Other Side, which if you haven't figured it out by now, let me just say it again so that it really drives in, is with Church on the Other Side, it is Lancaster Mennonite Conference church planting network focused on missional movement and multiplication. My wife and my daughters, we are not here, they're at home. I have two daughters and a third one due on Tuesday. And so we not only serve here in East Petersburg, but we live in East Petersburg. We are intentionally present. We are intentionally invested and integrated into the life of our neighborhood. We are hyper-local and we try to live, breathe, play, work, eat, shop, and worship as much as possible within the boundaries of our neighborhood. Very rarely do we like to eat outside of our town. Regardless of why you're here tonight, I think our realization is that our journeys this weekend need to start with this one thing. And this is going to be my prophetic statement for the night. And you can take it or you can leave it. But I think the era in which churches are known for being destination churches or celebrity communities is dead and over. And most Mennonite churches are still operating in this culture and we need to move past it. We need to become a people that are hyper-local in our neighborhoods. We need to be intentional about being part of that which we are actually inside. I believe when Jesus said that the greatest command is to love God and love your neighbor, that was actually a statement we are to live into, and that love your neighbor is a literal statement, that you are to literally love the person who is next to you. Most of us, unfortunately, know people that are like us much more than we know the 8 homes that are around us. In fact, a survey in 2006 said that less than 1% of people could name all 8 of their neighbors. Less than 1%. What's the greatest command? Love God and love your neighbor. But less than 1% of us can name the 8 homes that are around us. So to love our neighbor, we need to know our neighbor. And to know our neighbor, we need to be present in our neighborhood. So this week, take inventory on where you live, breathe, play, work, eat, shop, and worship, and how much time you spend doing those things in the boundaries of your neighborhood. If you want to hear how we're doing that, come to our workshop. So this evening, I am going to talk to you from a different angle than the people that just spoke. I'm going to be talking to you from an angle that I pitched to Brinton and Omar, and luckily they said, yeah, that's fine, let's talk about it. And I could tell you some of my success stories of launching a church or missional community, but tonight I want to talk to you and tell you the reality that I am a failed church planner. I have failed at church planning. You'll hear many successful stories and concepts this weekend, but I asked Bromar if I could bring this different angle. I wanted to share my story that is seemingly defined by failure. When I was 18, let me back up and tell you that I moved out of my house and into an apartment. I was heavily involved in the local punk rock scene, and I enjoyed music, and so I had lived out on my own at 18, a few weeks after graduating high school. I started to invite people to live with me, and before very long, I had my first intentional community going on. And as I became aware of where I was at in faith and journeying towards faith, I started people gathering. I started calling people into my small town house and found people to sit around and eat pizza and kind of explore all the biblical text with. Before you knew it, we would have 40 to 60 people squeezed into our living room. My landlord did not like that very much. But eventually, we started holding weekly worship gatherings and quickly gathered a sustainable model of people seeking after Jesus in their brokenness. However, that isn't my church planning story, because I loved music more than I loved what I was doing there, and I still wanted to make it as a rock star. So I left, and I began touring, and I began exploring the country and hitchhiking across the country with bands and organizations and what I would call troubadouring vagabonds. And as my days began to slow down on the road, I got married, and I had found myself in an intentional discipling relationship with a guy named Jerry. And Jerry was a pastor in a local vineyard church. And Jerry brought me under his wing, and he said, hey, to be honest, I think you're a pastor. I told Jerry he was number 1, and it wasn't with this finger. It wasn't where I was. It wasn't where I was thinking. I was not an institutional church guy. I didn't even know how to preach without swearing. So he would disciple me in many ways and shape my people gathering abilities. He would start to deal with a lot of my baggage, and he would taught me how to pastor, and even begin to release me to launch missional communities and urban missional neighborhood projects. And then he would prepare me to church plant through what was then called the Vineyard East Region Church Plant Boot Camps. And they were boot camps. They were long seminars and stories and people praying over you for hours and calling out prophetic words in you. It would be a great place to start this weekend with as well. Katie and I would go on to have several missional communities that were very fruitful and in urban context, but it's my journey and my approach of moving to California and failing at church planting that I want to tell you about tonight. Tonight I tell you that I was trained and I was discipled to be a fruitful or a successful church planner. In 2009, the Phillies were looking good. They were looking much better than they are looking right now. Anybody been watching games recently? Turned the game off last night, and they finally won one. I mean, they were looking so much better than they have recently. And besides baseball, I had Southern California on my mind as I was training the church plan. I couldn't shake it off my mind. And it's not just because I married a girl from Huntington Beach. I was discipled and trained at church plant, and I had found that the people that were training me had hoped that I would plant in the greater Philadelphia region, but really, my mind was in Southern California. And I was feeling this tug and this pull. And I also had begun to feel that I wasn't actually supposed to stay in the vineyard at this time. I was supposed to become Mennonite. And that didn't make sense because I didn't grow up Mennonite. I had a great-grandmother that once was Mennonite. She actually attended in the pews that you are sitting in now. But I, myself, was not Mennonite. In fact, I wasn't even sure I liked Mennonites. So I left my job as I began to chew on this, and I left the Keystone State, and I moved to Northern Virginia because I was almost 30, and I wanted to get one last tour under my belt before I was an old man, and 30 on the road is an old man. While in Virginia, we made home in a Mennonite congregation, a conservative Mennonite congregation, and they warmly welcomed me. And when we were not on the road, we were there every Sunday. We were part of their VBS program. We were part of small groups. In fact, it wasn't long till they allowed me to preach and teach Sunday school. And so they were hugely supportive when I told them about my plan to church plant in Southern California. In fact, they were supportive not only with prayer, but resources and finances, and eventually even ordination. So in 2010, my wife, who was several months pregnant, and I loaded our pets and everything we owned into a 24-foot U-Haul trailer, and we hooked our white minivan behind it, which also had a whole bunch of stuff in it, and we drove across the country in 3 days. Don't do that with a pregnant wife. Where's the pregnant wife? Don't drive across the country, okay? It's not good. There's a lot of stops that really annoy me. We headed to church plant in Huntington Beach, California. We had arrived in Southern California, and we began to instantly do what we do best. We became intentionally invested and integrated into the neighborhood. My wife started working as a preschool teacher. I started driving limousines. We had moved to church plant without a team. We wanted to disciple people off the streets. As we met and shared our vision with people, there was a great sense of excitement. People were, this is amazing. In fact, a local newspaper published an article that said, Mennonites have landed on the beach. However, our reality on the ground was shaped by a lot of things. Most people told us they loved our vision, they loved our values. In fact, they had always hoped that church would want to do this stuff. But then they said, we'll come back when you have the programs that the big churches have. See, we lived in an area where Mariners and Rock Harbor and Saddleback cast a big shadow. One pastor told me, that place right back there, and he was pointing to his large campus, that is where church plants come to die. In my defiance, I told him, not us, but we died. The people that did want to journey with us weren't people that were ready yet to take leadership. We had a wife she hated her husband's church, and he was a pastor. We had people that had just gotten out of prison. We had people that were struggling with their sexuality, and there were a bunch of broken people that said, we're willing to journey with you, but we're not quite ready to lead. We had people that were troublemakers who couldn't find home in institutional churches, people that were on their third or fourth wives, and they were saying, we would like to pastor, we'd like to follow along with you. Our sending organization, our third aspect of what we were dealing with on the ground was our sending organization didn't know how to relate to us. It had been some time since they had actually planted. And in their expectation, they wanted to see a Sunday morning worship gathering happen as soon as possible. As we begin to wrestle with that and hold down 60-hour-a-week jobs, my wife developed preeclampsia in her pregnancy, which would eventually lead to epilepsy and put her in bed rest for some time while we lived in California. But I wasn't giving up. In fact, I wanted to make our vision even more contagious. I wanted to find ways to share it more and tell more people about it. And I got louder about it and I shared more about it. I wanted to make it contagious and spreading. And as I met with more and more people, I found that slowly the silent and self-projected expectation of our sending organization and of the people that had financially supported us to come out there began to shape me in ways that I was not aware. I was losing passion to make disciples. because now I had to get serious and make church. I had to make church because of everything that was invested in us. Meanwhile, my wife, who's an introvert, began to deeply plant her elbow, sometimes literally, into my side. And she said, you know, I am a California girl, but I miss the East Coast. I liked it better back in Lancaster. See, the grass is always greener on the other side, because when I woke up in California, every day was a perfect day. I was 3 miles from the beach. It was 78 degrees. I would wake up and go, it's just a beautiful day. And my neighbors would say, it's like this every day. I had told her, just calm down these ideas of moving back to Lancaster. It's just because we're in a hard time right now, and we just got to make church happen. But eventually, God and my wife won out. And in late 2011, we announced we were pausing our vision to address health concerns. I was devastated, and moving back to Lancaster was tough. I had bought a surfboard. Why am I moving back to Lancaster? I had left everything for this. The weather was perfect. Couldn't find ham loaf, but I had great Mexican. Traveling home was rough. Katie flew home with our daughter and our cat, and I traveled home in a 24-foot U-Haul, dragging our white minivan with everything loaded in it, packed less nicely this time, and I traveled through the desert as my first day. I felt like a dog with his tail tucked between his legs. I was waiting for God to hit me with a rolled-up newspaper on my nose. Even though God would meet me on the trip home, and He would even give me words and a vision that, if I would have thought about it, clearly showed me that I was even going to land here in East Petersburg, I couldn't get over it because I was devastated. I had let people down. I dreamed of a return. I began to plan, what would it mean to return to California? One of the reasons we too moved back was to care for my grandmother, who had just lost my grandfather, and she had dementia as well as osteoporosis. And so, we'll care for her till she passes. And then, by then, we'll be ready to return to California, and I'll be able to pick up that mantle that I left there. However, what happened is the next few years, I wrestled with an identity of who I was, and I began to even wrestle quietly with a sense of failure. Years later, I would own that we were fruitful at our kingdom work, but failed at church planting successfully. This weekend, you'll be hearing powerful stories of people that have been successful at church planting. This weekend is full of powerful stories of multiplication and missional engagement. These stories will motivate us. They will energize us. They will make us powerfully inspired, and they will even make us see that abstract ideas have now suddenly become attainable. However, I think there's some things that we need to be aware of in these conversations and at conferences like this as well. First, I don't know why you're here, but every Christian is a sent one. That's what Alan Hirsch says. There is no such thing as an on-sent Christian. You are not here because you are in a supportive role of a church planter. You are here because you are a sent Christian. 2, I love this quote by Mike Breen. What is the engine of the church? Discipleship. I've said it many times. If you make disciples, you will get the church. But if you try to build a church, you will rarely get disciples. Don't lose vision of a discipleship because all of a sudden now you have to create church. Number 3 is, as you hear stories, don't copy and paste church plants and churches. Copy and paste churches and church plants always end up in death or exhausted people. Really understand what God is showing you uniquely. Not what He is showing people in Bethlehem or what He's showing people in Annapolis or what He's showing us here in a 300-year-old church, but show up and let God speak to you uniquely. Be energized by the stories you hear this weekend, but don't copy and paste them. 4th, never ever confuse fruitfulness for success. I don't believe we can reach success in church planting or church revitalization until we are focused on what it means to be fruitful for the kingdom. Next, your insecurity and failure should never stop you from trusting Jesus in new adventures. I don't know why, but far too often, We find ourselves made up of introverts and people that are insecure. And some of that time feels like it comes off as a spiritual pride. And it tends to keep us comfortable and in. And sometimes when we hear someone that's failed at something, like a church planter, then we say, that person should probably never do something again. Somehow we've gotten comfortable with ourselves. The worst thing we do is think that we have to have everything planned out before we leap. I love the story of the way Paul just walks around with his church plants. I love following him throughout all of Pauline theology because Paul leaps much more than he thinks strategically. Even though he talks loud and you think he's a strategic guy, Paul is a leaper. Don't allow your failure and your insecurity to hold you back from trying something new. It's okay to develop a sense of boldness. Recently, I was at a large church planting conference in Florida, and Will Mancini put it like this: we are kept from our goal not by obstacles, but by a clear path to a lesser goal. Let me read that again. We are kept from our goal not by obstacles, but by a clear path to a lesser goal. So as I come to a close, I want to give you a tool to walk away with. But first, let me try to guess the 7 camps that I think are represented here today. I realize there's probably a mix of emotions that are running through our minds. Church planting seems scary, it seems exciting, it seems big, it seems easy, it seems uneasy, it depends who you are. And some of you might be just thinking, I should have went to Aunt Harriet's ham loaf picnic. I realize there's probably 7 camps represented in this community gathering. And this tool that I'm going to give to you, which I've learned from church plant failure and also missional community success, I want to give you these 7 camps that I think make you up, and I'm going to tell you that the tool applies to all of you. I think there's some here today that are exploring church planting. There's some that are looking to practice fresh expressions of church, microbreweries, coffee shops, whatever. There are some of you who are facilitating missional communities and understanding the idea of what it means to be an oikos in a house church movement. Some of you are dreaming about church revitalization. Hello, 1720. We're dreaming about church revitalization. Some of you are hoping to multiply your church into multiple campuses or into just having a few more people to keep the bench warm. Some of you might be serving in a coaching role to a church planter. Some of you might just be supportive Mennonite Conference junkies. Some of you have been doing that for a long time. But I want you to listen to this. When you came in, you should have received a paper. You can pick one up on your way out if you didn't. And I want to teach you this tool that I use, and I call it the Stay on Target tool. It's on the back of the paper you received. I think it applies to 6 of the 7 camps I've named. Mennonite junkies, I don't know how you would use this tool, so I left you out of this one. At the center of that is Britton. You can put your hand up, and Britton has a copy of the target. I'll give it a second as Britton comes forward. This tool, I think, is one way that as you revisit it and use it, it keeps you from becoming victims to expectation and the weight of what people are thinking about you and those who have invested in you. The first thing that we see there at the center of this target, and obviously we're Mennonites and we're pacifists, so this is not a gun target. Maybe it is just a target for bow and arrow fun or whatever you want it. But in the center of that is a solid white square, and that is the bullseye. That is the thing you are trying to hit if you are target practicing, right? You don't want to land in one of those outer rings. If you want to land somewhere, you want to hit your target. And so the most important thing to do is to name your target. Who is my target? Who is it that God has called me to? Who is it that God has called you to? You don't have to be a church planter to answer this question. Has He called you to work with people in retirement homes? Has He called you to work with people in the creative music scene? Has He called you to work with people in a specific area or specific people that are in your sphere of influence? What is the target that you know you were designed and created to reach? Second thing is that little white outer line, that clear one there, and that is where you put your vision. As you begin to think about what is the vision, you can ask yourself these questions. What has God given you a vision for? What vision has God given you? When I was coming across the desert, wrestling with what it meant to be a failed church planter, I remember sitting in New Mexico and just staring out into the blackness of the dark night. The cold air was blowing through the desert. My friend Darrell was in the restroom. And I just stared there and I heard, create and share. Create and share. And this would be one of many prophetic words I would hear on my trip back, but I didn't understand what it meant other than it was a vision that I was called to be a person who created and shared in community. Listen to God. What is the vision that He has given you? The next ring is values. And what are values? What does God want you to value? What simple foundations will be how you accomplish your vision, but shape your mission focus? So here at East Petersburg Mennonite Church, our vision is to be a community that is learning to live and love like Jesus in East Petersburg. The vision says the place and what we're trying to accomplish. We do that by focusing on, and you can see these things hanging out there, worship, a sense of deep community that it moves us into mission. What are the things that are going to become the lens in which you see everything else through? The next thing that I think is important is to name your goals. What goals do you envision? This is one of the areas, these outer rings are where we begin to fail the most. And it's one of the things that I realized that we failed the most when we were church planting is, what goals do you envision? What is it that God has given you that you hope to accomplish? What fluid ideas do you hope to reach? Where do you want to go? I mean, if I'm playing baseball, the goal is to win a game, right? But we don't name wins for churches. We just say, Sunday morning's a win. What are the fluid ideas that you hope to accomplish? And I say fluid because they need to be flexible, because as you move and live into your vision, you will find they change. The next thing is benchmarks. What are your measurements? What benchmarks will help you know if you are fruitful and achieving your mission? How do you know when you've reached those goals? How do you know when you need to revisit your vision and say, oh, we missed what we were aiming for? Or when do you look at your benchmarks and go, man, we've gotten distracted from that? And the last thing is the outer space around the target. Patterns for reproduction and multiplication. Whoa, that is not how you spell multiplication. Multiplication. There we go. So that is patterns for reproduction and multiplication. What are your patterns for reproduction? Begin to think, how, even though we are just getting started in this project or this church plan, how are we going to reproduce and multiply the mission focus that God has given us? Let me leave you with this. God has designed you to multiply. This week, as you're here and part of this church planning weekend, listen to His voice. Listen to the inspiration you get from others, but listen to His voice and stay on target with your response to it. Remember, guys, as you move through this, I want to be moved by your success and your fruitfulness. So, #I will multiply, and I look forward to seeing what God is doing in you this weekend.